There's a peculiar pattern visible from space that most of us never think about. At night, when satellite cameras capture the glow of human civilization, certain points around the Indian Ocean shine brighter than others. Ports, massive infrastructure projects, naval facilities, and if you trace them on a map, they form something that looks less like random development and more like a carefully placed necklace, each bead positioned with geometric precision around a single landmass in the center. India. The question isn't whether this pattern exists. The question is whether it was designed, or whether we're seeing intention where there's only coincidence. And perhaps more importantly, whether the difference even matters. Geography, it turns out, has a memory. Long after empires fall and borders shift, the land itself remembers. Mountains still channel armies along predictable routes. Rivers still determine where cities rise. And oceans, those vast spaces we think of as open and free, become highways or barriers depending on who controls the points where ships must pass. For thousands of years, India sat at the center of the Indian Ocean, a position that should have made it the master of maritime trade routes connecting Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Should have. But history has a way of turning geographic advantages into liabilities when nations look the wrong direction at the wrong time. Consider how empires think about space. The Mughal Empire, which dominated the Indian subcontinent for centuries, built its power on land. Its magnificent cities, its administrative systems, its military strength, all pointed inward and northward. The mountains mattered. The northern frontier mattered. The ocean was where trade happened, certainly, but not where power was contested. When the British arrived, they understood something the Mughals hadn't prioritized. Control the coasts, control the ports, and you control the wealth flowing through them. The British Raj was fundamentally a maritime empire that happened to rule land, not the other way around. But even the British focused their strategic attention on defending India from land invasions through Afghanistan, the famous Great Game against Russian expansion southward. This creates a particular kind of blindness. When you spend centuries thinking about threats from one direction, your entire strategic culture orients that way. Your generals train for mountain warfare. Your intelligence services watch land borders. Your political class obsesses over the neighbor you've fought multiple times. And while you're watching that direction with intense focus, the ocean at your back becomes background, not foreground. It's always been there. It will always be there. Until, quite suddenly, it isn't yours anymore. In October of 1962, something happened that would shape Indian strategic thinking for generations. Chinese forces, in a brief but devastating conflict, inflicted a humiliating defeat on Indian troops in the Himalayan borderlands. The war lasted exactly 1 month. Its psychological impact lasted decades. Nations, like people, carry trauma. And traumatized nations, like traumatized people, often become hypervigilant about the specific threat that hurt them while developing blind spots elsewhere. India's defense establishment internalized a powerful lesson from 1962. The threat comes from the north. The threat comes over land. The threat comes from China. But here's the paradox. While India learned to watch the Himalayas with obsessive intensity, China learned something entirely different from the same event. China's own historical trauma runs deeper and wider than a single border war. For a century and a half, from the Opium Wars of the 1840s through the end of World War II and the Civil War that followed, China experienced what its historians call the century of humiliation. Foreign powers didn't just defeat China militarily. They carved it into spheres of influence, controlled its ports, dictated its trade terms, and demonstrated that China's traditional land-based power meant nothing against nations that controlled the seas. The British, the French, the Americans, the Japanese, all arrived by ship. All used naval power to enforce their will. And when the Communist Party finally reunified China in 1949, its leaders inherited not just a country, but a civilizational memory of vulnerability to maritime threats. This matters because it explains why two nations that share a border think about security in fundamentally different ways. India's strategic culture, shaped by Mughal inheritance and British land defense and the trauma of 1962, sees threats primarily as land-based. China's strategic culture, shaped by the century of humiliation and its island geography in the sense that its coast is its soft underbelly, sees threats as maritime. Not exclusively, of course. Both countries maintain huge land armies. Both worry about their land borders. But when Chinese strategists think about their country's greatest vulnerability, they think about one specific problem that keeps them awake at night. It's called the Malacca Dilemma. 80% of China's oil imports, the lifeblood of its industrial economy, flow through a single narrow strait between Malaysia and Indonesia. The Strait of Malacca is only 1.5 miles wide at its narrowest point. 1.5 miles. If you wanted to cripple China's economy without firing a shot on Chinese soil, you would park a naval blockade there and wait. The Chinese leadership understands this with uncomfortable clarity. During any major conflict, particularly one involving the United States and its Pacific allies, China's energy imports could be cut off in a matter of hours. Not days. Hours. This is not paranoia. This is geography as destiny. But here's where geography stops being just physical space and becomes psychological space. When you're vulnerable at a choke point, you have two options. You can accept the vulnerability and hope your relationships with other powers remain stable. Or you can work, patiently and systematically, to bypass the choke point entirely, to create alternative routes, to build relationships and infrastructure in places that give you options when the main route becomes unusable. This is not aggressive in the traditional sense. From Beijing's perspective, it's defensive. It's survival. And it requires thinking not in terms of the next election cycle or the next quarterly report, but in terms of decades. The human mind struggles with incremental change. We're built to notice sudden movements, loud noises, dramatic events. A tiger leaping from the grass triggers every alarm system evolution gave us. A glacier advancing 1 inch per year goes unnoticed until it's already transformed the landscape. Psychologists call this the boiling frog syndrome, though the actual experiment this is based on has been thoroughly debunked. The metaphor persists because it captures something true about human perception. Gradual change, even catastrophic gradual change, often fails to trigger our threat detection systems until far too late. Now imagine you're a Chinese strategist in the early 2000s. Your country's economy is growing at double-digit rates. Your energy needs are skyrocketing. Your primary supply route runs through a strait controlled by countries allied with or friendly to the United States. You have a land border with India, a country you fought in 1962, a country that views you with suspicion, a country that sits at the geographic center of the Indian Ocean. You cannot change geography. You cannot make the Strait of Malacca wider or move it under your control. But you can, over time, build alternatives. The strategy that emerged has a name now, though it's debated whether Chinese planners ever called it this themselves. Western analysts labeled it the string of pearls. The metaphor is almost too elegant. A string of ports, infrastructure investments, and strategic relationships, each one a pearl, stretching from China's southern coast, around Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean to the Middle East and Africa. On maps, it literally looks like a necklace. And in the center, encircled, sits India. But here's what makes this fascinating from a psychological and economic perspective. Each individual pearl makes perfect sense on its own. Each one can be justified purely on commercial grounds, with no military implications whatsoever. And that's precisely what makes the pattern so difficult to respond to. If your rival builds a military base on your border, the threat is obvious. Your response is clear. But if your rival invests in a commercial port in a third country, a port that genuinely does facilitate trade and economic development, what exactly are you responding to? Their generosity? Their business acumen? The paranoid fantasy that they might, someday, possibly, use that port for military purposes? Let's trace the necklace, pearl by pearl, and watch how commercial logic and strategic positioning become impossible to separate. Gwadar, a deep-water port on Pakistan's southwestern coast, facing the Arabian Sea. On the surface, this is a straightforward infrastructure project under China's massive Belt and Road Initiative. Pakistan gets a modern port that can boost its economy. China gets an alternative route for importing energy, one that bypasses the Malacca Strait entirely. Oil can be shipped to Gwadar, then transported overland through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a network of roads, railways, and pipelines worth over $60 billion. Purely economically rational. Except Gwadar sits less than 400 miles from the Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil passes. Except Pakistan and India are rivals who have fought 4 wars since partition. Except in geopolitics, the ancient wisdom holds true. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Or more precisely, the enemy of my enemy is someone I can work with in ways that make my enemy uncomfortable. China doesn't need to explicitly target India to make India nervous. It just needs to develop deep economic and strategic ties with Pakistan, and geography does the rest. The psychology of this is subtle. When two countries already distrust each other, any strengthening of one's position looks like a threat to the other, regardless of stated intentions. This is called the security dilemma in international relations theory. Actions you take to make yourself safer, genuinely to make yourself safer, make your rival feel less safe, which causes them to take actions that make you feel less safe, and the spiral continues. Neither side is necessarily lying about their intentions. Both sides are responding rationally to their perception of the threat environment. And both sides become trapped in a pattern neither fully chose, but both perpetuate. Move southeast. Sri Lanka. Hambantota Port. This one tells a different kind of story, one that reveals how economic tools become strategic weapons without anyone necessarily plotting conquest. Sri Lanka wanted infrastructure development. China offered loans on terms that looked attractive. The port was built. Then Sri Lanka, struggling with debt, couldn't make payments. China offered a solution. Convert the debt to equity. Hand over the port on a 99-year lease. Suddenly, China has a deep-water port less than 200 miles from India's southern tip. Now, is this predatory lending or standard international finance? Did China deliberately trap Sri Lanka in debt, or did Sri Lanka's government make risky borrowing decisions? These questions generate fierce debate. But from a purely strategic perspective, the mechanism is fascinating. Traditional colonialism required military conquest. You sent gunboats and troops, you planted your flag, you ruled directly. Modern strategic positioning can happen through balance sheets and infrastructure contracts. No invasion necessary. No war crimes. Just loans, construction projects, and the slow transfer of leverage from debtor to creditor. The psychological impact of this on India is worth examining. If China had tried to establish a military base in Sri Lanka through force, India could have responded clearly. It might have been a crisis, but at least the lines would be obvious. Instead, what India watches is its neighbor, a country with which it has historical and cultural ties, gradually shifting into China's economic orbit through mechanisms that look peaceful and even beneficial to Sri Lankan development. How do you counter that? Do you offer better loan terms? Do you compete in infrastructure development? Do you accept that smaller nations will pursue their economic interests even when it makes you strategically uncomfortable? Bangladesh. Chittagong. Here the pattern repeats with variations. Chinese investment in port development. Economic benefits for Bangladesh. Strategic positioning for China. And India, watching from next door, faces the same dilemma. Bangladesh has every right to pursue economic development with whoever offers the best terms. But from India's perspective, Chinese infrastructure projects in Bangladesh are encirclement, one more pearl on the string. Myanmar. Kayakpiu. Another port. Another oil and gas pipeline running from the Bay of Bengal directly into China's Yunnan province. Another bypass of the Malacca Strait. And Myanmar, caught in internal conflicts and international isolation over human rights issues, has fewer options than most nations about where to find investment and political support. China offers both without the conditionality that Western nations attach. Is this exploitation of Myanmar's weakness? Is it pragmatic partnership? The answer might be both, which is precisely what makes analysis difficult. And then, the piece that transforms the pattern from regional to global. Djibouti, a small nation on the Horn of Africa, strategically positioned where the Red Sea meets the Gulf of Aden. In 2017, China opened its first overseas military base there. Not a port that could hypothetically support military operations. An actual military base. The justification was anti-piracy operations, protecting Chinese shipping from the Somali pirates who had made those waters dangerous. Reasonable. Defensive. And yet, compare this to European colonial history. In the Age of Sail, European powers established coaling stations around the world. These were officially just places where ships could refuel. Purely logistical. But coaling stations became forts. Forts became colonies. Infrastructure justified for peaceful commerce became the scaffolding of empire. Now, is China repeating this pattern? Is the Belt and Road Initiative just the Marshall Plan in reverse, development aid with geopolitical benefits? Or is it something more deliberately strategic, a long-term plan to reshape global power dynamics through infrastructure rather than aircraft carriers? The fascinating thing is that these questions might not have single answers. States are not individuals with unified consciousness and clear intentions. They're massive bureaucracies where different factions pursue different goals under the banner of national interest. Chinese commercial interests genuinely want profitable ports and secure trade routes. Chinese military planners genuinely want options for power projection and the ability to protect sea lanes. Chinese political leaders genuinely want China to reclaim what they see as its historical position of preeminence in Asia. All of these can be true simultaneously, and the infrastructure projects serve all of these goals at once. This is where ancient strategic thinking meets modern economics. Sun Tzu, writing in the 5th century BCE, observed that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, not through clever tactics on the battlefield, but by making the battlefield unnecessary. By creating situations where your opponent's best option is to accept your preferences without contest. You win before the war begins. The string of pearls, viewed this way, is Sun Tzu updated for an era of global supply chains and international finance. You don't conquer India. You surround it with economic relationships and strategic infrastructure until its options narrow. But there's a deeper philosophical framework at work here, one rooted in how different civilizations think about order and power. The Chinese concept of tianxia, often translated as all under heaven, envisions a hierarchical world order where the civilizational center, historically China, maintains harmony through its cultural and economic superiority rather than direct military control. Tributary states weren't conquered provinces. They were autonomous entities that acknowledged China's centrality and received trade access and protection in return. This is not Western-style sovereignty between equal nation-states. It's a different model entirely. Whether modern China consciously pursues tianxia or whether Western analysts project this ancient framework onto contemporary actions is debatable. But the pattern fits. China doesn't need to control these ports militarily. It needs them to acknowledge economic dependence and strategic alignment. The infrastructure creates the relationship. The relationship creates the influence. The influence shapes decisions. And slowly, the regional order shifts. Now contrast this with how democracies operate. The Chinese Communist Party can make decisions that won't bear fruit for 30 years. The leadership that starts a project might not be alive when it completes, but institutional continuity means the project continues anyway. Democratic governments work in election cycles. For years, maybe 8 if you're lucky. Long-term strategic planning exists, certainly, but it competes with immediate political pressures. Infrastructure projects must show results within time frames that match voter attention spans. This creates an asymmetry. Autocracies can be patient. Democracies must be responsive. India's response to encirclement reveals this asymmetry clearly. The theoretical counter to the string of pearls is obvious. Build your own pearls. Invest in ports across the Indian Ocean. Develop infrastructure partnerships with the same countries China is courting. Offer better terms, more transparent deals, development without the debt traps. India has tried this. The problem is resources and time. India's economy, impressive in its own right and growing, is still less than a quarter the size of China's. Its infrastructure development capacity, its ability to finance and build massive projects quickly, lags significantly behind China's state capitalism model. When Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Myanmar looks at offers from China and offers from India, the Chinese terms often look better simply because China can afford to make them better. It's not that India lacks will or strategy. It's that it's playing catch-up against a rival with more resources and a head start measured in decades. India's Sagar initiative, security and growth for all in the region, represents an attempt at soft power in the Indian Ocean. It's philosophically appealing. Rather than dominance, partnership. Rather than debt, sustainable development. But philosophy doesn't build ports. Money and engineering capacity build ports. And here India faces a cruel irony. The natural geographic advantages that should make India the dominant power in the Indian Ocean, its central position, its long coastline, its naval traditions, matter less than economic capacity and political will mobilized over sustained time periods. The Quad Alliance, bringing together India, the United States, Japan, and Australia, represents a different kind of response. If you can't match your rival economically, you balance with allies. This is classic alliance theory. When a rising power threatens the regional order, other powers band together to contain it. It worked against Napoleon. It worked against Germany in 2 world wars. It formed the basis of Cold War containment strategy against the Soviet Union. But the Quad faces challenges those earlier alliances didn't. First, the members have different priorities. The United States worries about China globally, and particularly in the Pacific. Japan worries about China in East Asia. Australia worries about China's economic coercion and security presence in the South Pacific. India worries about encirclement in the Indian Ocean and the land border in the Himalayas. These aren't identical interests that naturally align. They're overlapping concerns that require constant diplomatic management. Second, all four are democracies, which creates transparency problems. When you're planning strategic responses to an authoritarian rival, you must do some of that planning in public, or at least in view of media and legislative oversight. This makes surprise difficult. It makes long-term commitment uncertain because governments change and commitments can be reversed. China, watching the Quad, can be reasonably confident that internal disagreements, election results, and public opinion will constrain its effectiveness in ways that don't constrain Chinese decision-making. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Quad members remain economically entangled with China in ways that limit their options. Japan and Australia count China as their largest trading partner. India, despite border tensions, trades with China at levels exceeding $130 billion annually. You can be strategic rivals while being economic partners. History shows this clearly, but it creates hesitation. Every escalation carries economic costs that voters and businesses will notice. India has tried building its own counterpearl. Chabahar port in Iran offers access to Afghanistan and Central Asia while bypassing Pakistan. Strategically brilliant on paper. In practice, the project faces delays, funding challenges, and the complexity of U.S. sanctions on Iran that make Indian companies nervous about involvement. This is the infrastructure equivalent of fighting with one hand tied behind your back. China doesn't face these constraints. It proceeds regardless of Western disapproval. Then there's the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, India's own unsinkable aircraft carrier stretching 600 miles south from its mainland. These islands sit astride the approaches to the Malacca Strait. If you wanted to monitor or potentially interdict shipping through that choke point, this is where you'd do it. India has, slowly, been militarizing these islands. But slowly is the operative word. Environmental concerns, indigenous populations, bureaucratic process, budget constraints, all slow the pace of development. Meanwhile, China's pearls continue their installation. This creates a psychological dynamic worth examining. When you're encircled, or perceive yourself as encircled, threat assessment becomes difficult. Is every Chinese port a genuine military threat, or are you seeing shadows where there's only commerce? The paradox is that overreaction strengthens the narrative of Indian aggression that China can use to justify its own actions. Underreaction allows the encirclement to tighten. Threading this needle requires constant recalibration of threat perception versus actual threat. Psychologists who study threat perception note that visible, dramatic threats trigger stronger responses than gradual, distributed ones. Pakistan, India's historical rival, is visible. It's right there across the border. Conflicts are regular and acute. China's maritime infrastructure development is gradual and diffuse. Each individual project seems manageable. The aggregate pattern emerges slowly. By the time it's fully visible, it's already deeply embedded. This is the boiling frog again, not as metaphor, but as actual strategic challenge. There's a historical parallel worth considering. The Great Game, Britain and Russia's 19th century competition for influence in Central Asia, was also about encirclement and buffer states. Russia expanded southward toward India. Britain sought to create buffer territories that would prevent Russian access. Afghanistan became a graveyard of imperial ambitions precisely because it was the buffer both empires needed but neither could effectively control. The methods differed from today's debt diplomacy and port development, but the logic was identical. Control the approaches, control the strategic space, control the options your rival has. The Cold War offered another model. Containment. The United States built a network of alliances and bases surrounding the Soviet Union, from NATO in Europe to partnerships in Asia. the Soviets were effectively encircled. This didn't prevent them from being a superpower, but it constrained their options and contributed to the economic strain that eventually led to collapse. China, studying this history, understands containment viscerally. The string of pearls, from this angle, is preemptive counter-containment. By establishing positions around India, China makes Indian containment of China far more difficult. But all of this analysis assumes encirclement is deliberate, that there's a master plan in Beijing with India as the target. There's an alternative interpretation worth considering. China's primary strategic concern is energy security and the Malacca Dilemma. The belt and road infrastructure, the ports, the pipelines, they're genuinely about bypassing that vulnerability. India happens to be in the center of the region where these bypasses must go. The encirclement, from this view, is coincidental. Not unnoticed by Chinese planners, certainly. Maybe even convenient. But not the driving purpose. This distinction matters because it affects how India should respond. If encirclement is deliberate targeting, the response is zero-sum competition and alliance balancing. If encirclement is incidental to China's pursuit of energy security, the response might include finding ways to make China's energy routes compatible with Indian interests, or at least not threatening to them. The challenge is that even if the encirclement started as incidental, it creates capabilities that can be repurposed. A commercial port can host military vessels. A relationship built on infrastructure loans can evolve into strategic alignment. Game theory offers a framework for thinking about this. In a prisoner's dilemma, both players do better if they cooperate, but each has an incentive to defect. Mutual cooperation produces the best outcome. Mutual defection produces the worst. But if you cooperate while the other defects, you get exploited. The rational response, perversely, is to defect. Both players know this, so both defect, even though both would be better off cooperating. China and India are trapped in a multi-generational prisoner's dilemma played across dozens of issues simultaneously. Both countries would benefit from peaceful coexistence and economic cooperation. Both are climate vulnerable and would gain from cooperation on environmental challenges. Both are developing nations with massive populations to lift out of poverty. The resources spent on strategic competition could go toward development. And yet, neither can fully trust the other to cooperate. So both pursue competitive strategies that make cooperation less likely, which reinforces the mutual distrust, and the cycle continues. The future plays out along several possible paths, none of them certain, all of them shaped by decisions yet to be made. Escalation. A trigger event, maybe in the Himalayas where Chinese and Indian troops face off, maybe a naval incident in the Indian Ocean, maybe spillover from a Taiwan crisis, pushes both nations toward conflict. Both are nuclear powers, which makes total war unthinkable. But limited war, border conflicts, naval skirmishes, these remain possible. The economic consequences would be severe. Supply chains would rupture. Trade would halt. Regional powers would be forced to choose sides. The global economy, integrated in ways that make the 1930s look parochial, would suffer disruption measured in trillions of dollars. Coexistence. Economic interdependence and mutual recognition of nuclear danger keep competition managed and tensions controlled. China gets its energy security. India develops its economy and regional relationships. Both accept that total dominance is impossible and mutual accommodation is necessary. Historical precedent exists for this. The U.S. and Soviet Union never fought directly, despite decades of competition. Their economic interdependence was minimal, but nuclear weapons enforced caution. China and India have both nuclear weapons and significant trade. Maybe that's enough. The challenge to coexistence is that it requires both sides to accept limits on their ambitions. China would need to accept that India has legitimate security interests in the Indian Ocean that Chinese infrastructure shouldn't threaten. India would need to accept that China will pursue energy security and economic relationships in South Asia regardless of Indian preferences. This kind of mutual acceptance is psychologically difficult. National pride, historical grievances, domestic political pressures, all push toward competition rather than accommodation. Then there's the possibility of decoupling. Economic nationalism rises globally. Supply chains regionalize. Countries prioritize strategic autonomy over economic efficiency. In this scenario, China and India both attempt to reduce dependence on each other and on the global system generally. Trade decreases. Investment flows reverse. The technological integration that characterizes the current moment fragments into competing blocks, maybe a Chinese sphere, an American sphere, an Indian attempt at non-alignment or leadership of a third bloc. Decoupling sounds clean on paper. In practice, it's economically destructive. Efficiency comes from specialization and trade. When nations try to do everything themselves for security reasons, they accept lower productivity, higher costs, slower growth. The pre-World War I global economy was highly integrated. Trade connected Europe's great powers tightly. Many believe this made war impossible, that economic interdependence would enforce peace. It didn't. When war came, the economic ties snapped, and nations discovered they could endure economic pain if national survival or prestige seemed to require it. Whether the 21st century repeats this pattern or avoids it remains open. We know more than our great-grandparents did about how wars start and how devastating they can be. We have nuclear weapons that make total war suicidal. We have economic integration that makes conflict costly even for winners. But we also have nationalism, historical memory, and the psychological dynamics that drove conflict for millennia before nuclear weapons and global supply chains emerged. From a wider angle, the India-China dynamic is a laboratory for questions that extend far beyond South Asia. Can rising powers ascend peacefully in a system designed by and for established powers? Can autocracies and democracies coexist stably when their decision-making timelines and processes differ fundamentally? Can economic tools fully substitute for military ones in great power competition, or do they just delay inevitable confrontation? Can nations cooperate on existential threats like climate change while competing for security and influence? The string of pearls, viewed this way, is more than a geopolitical strategy. It's a test case. If China can establish regional influence primarily through infrastructure investment and economic relationships rather than military conquest, it suggests a model for power transition that doesn't require war. If India can respond effectively despite resource constraints and democratic limitations, it suggests that open societies can compete with authoritarian ones in long-term strategic competition. If both nations find a way to coexist despite mutual distrust and conflicting interests, it offers hope for managing the larger tensions between established and rising powers globally. But there's a darker reading available too. If infrastructure becomes weaponized, if debt becomes a tool of domination, if economic integration fails to prevent conflict, then the 21st century might look more like the 19th and 20th than we hoped. Small nations caught between great powers would face impossible choices between development and sovereignty. Global trade routes would militarize. The openness that characterizes the current international system would close, replaced by spheres of influence and competition for control. What should we take from all this? Several lessons seem to emerge, though none of them are comfortable. First, geography still matters. We live in an age of instant communication and digital connectivity, which creates the illusion that physical space is less important than it used to be. Not true. Trade still moves on ships through specific passages. Energy still flows through pipelines and tanker routes. Military power still requires bases and logistics. The Indian Ocean remains the Indian Ocean, shaped by the same coastlines and currents that affected trade 3,000 years ago. Technology changes how we use geography. It doesn't make geography irrelevant. Second, economic power converts to strategic power, but with a lag and not automatically. China's economic growth over the past 4 decades enabled the Belt and Road Initiative and the String of Pearls. But wealth alone doesn't translate to influence. It must be deployed deliberately, directed toward strategic goals, sustained over time. India has substantial economic resources, but has struggled to convert them into strategic infrastructure as effectively as China has. This suggests that state capacity, organizational coherence, and long-term planning matter as much as raw economic size. Third, incremental strategies defeat reactive ones. If China had attempted to establish military dominance in the Indian Ocean through a sudden buildup, it would have triggered immediate and coordinated response. By moving gradually, each step justifiable on commercial grounds, the pattern emerged slowly enough that response was always delayed. By the time encirclement became visible, it was substantially complete. This is a lesson about how change happens. Slow, persistent, Incremental action accumulates into transformation before opposition can organize. Fourth, democracies and autocracies play different games. This isn't about which system is better morally or economically. It's about time horizons and decision-making processes. Autocracies can make long-term commitments and endure short-term costs more easily than democracies can, because they don't face regular elections or public accountability. Democracies respond to public pressure and electoral cycles, which makes them adaptive and self-correcting, but also short-term focused. Neither system has inherent advantage in all circumstances, but in contests requiring patient, sustained effort over decades, autocracies have structural advantages. Fifth, we notice drama and miss patterns. A military invasion captures global attention immediately. A port construction project barely registers. But 20 port construction projects, coordinated over 2 decades, might alter the strategic balance more than an invasion would have. Human psychology is not well calibrated to detect this kind of threat. We're pattern-seeking animals, but we're better at seeing patterns in retrospect than in real time. By the time the pattern is obvious, response becomes harder. And finally, perhaps most importantly, nations caught between great powers have agency but limited options. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, these aren't pawns moved by China and India according to some grand strategy. They're countries pursuing their own interests with the cards they've been dealt. Sometimes those interests align with Chinese preferences, sometimes with Indian. Often they try to play both sides, extracting maximum benefit while minimizing dependence on either. This is rational behavior. It's also exhausting and risky. History is littered with small nations crushed between competing empires. The string of pearls might be best understood not as a conspiracy, but as an inevitability given the starting conditions. China needs energy security and seeks to bypass vulnerabilities. The geography of oil transport routes points to specific locations for infrastructure. Those locations happen to encircle India. India, perceiving threat, responds in ways that confirm Chinese suspicions about Indian intentions. Both sides are rational. Both sides are responding to genuine security concerns. And both sides are trapped in a dynamic that neither fully controls. There's something almost tragic about it. Tragedy, in the classical sense, isn't about evil defeating good. It's about good intentions colliding with structural constraints to produce outcomes nobody wanted. China doesn't want conflict with India. It wants energy security. India doesn't want conflict with China. It wants to develop its economy and maintain its regional position. But the pursuit of these individually rational goals creates collision points that could, under the wrong circumstances, spiral toward the very conflict both wish to avoid. Whether they do spiral depends on decisions not yet made, on leadership not yet in power, on crises not yet emerged. The pessimistic reading of history suggests that rising and established powers almost always fight. The optimistic reading notes that nuclear weapons and economic integration create deterrents that didn't exist in previous eras. The realistic reading acknowledges that we don't know. We're watching the experiment in real time. What we can say is this: the world is watching two civilizations with 4,000 years of history between them, representing 40% of humanity, navigate a power transition in an interconnected global economy with nuclear weapons and climate change as background conditions. If they manage it peacefully, if they find ways to compete without destroying, if they cooperate on shared threats while managing their differences, they will have accomplished something genuinely new in human history. If they don't, if the old patterns reassert themselves, if economic ties prove insufficient to prevent conflict, then the 21st century will look tragically familiar. The pearls are already strung. The necklace is already visible. What happens next isn't predetermined. It will be chosen, one decision at a time, by leaders responding to pressures we can identify but can't fully predict. Geography sets the board. Economics determines the pieces. Psychology shapes how they're played. And history watches to see if we've learned anything at all.